So we left off last time with Richard Nixon winding up the Vietnam War, which most people, and me included, consider one of the low points in American history because basically Nixon said, declare victory, get out. And we did in 60 days, and we left everything. We left all our allies, and Vietnam fell shortly after that. So when you see those great photographs of Richard Nixon doing this, yes, V for victory, it's a lie. And that's a clue to Richard Nixon. Okay, he did do some very, very good things. He did get us out of Vietnam, not in a great way, but he did. He did de-escalate nuclear arms with Russia. That was a huge accomplishment. He opened up China. That was a huge accomplishment. The other thing that I didn't touch on last time, and this is under the Nixon file, is the Yom Kippur War, which was in October of '73. And Egypt and Syria invaded Israel, a surprise attack. Israel, with a lot of U.S. aid, pushed back, expanded, took the whole Sinai from Egypt at the time. The United States brokered a peace. This was a very quick lightning war on the part of Israel. And long-term effects of that is that OPEC, oil producing and exporting countries, which was most of the oil producers in the Mideast, in retaliation, cut oil production. They stopped shipping us oil, in other words. Prices of oil quadrupled within a month. Today, they're doing quite the opposite. Oil prices have fallen dramatically because with the COVID virus, people aren't working, people aren't driving, people aren't traveling, the airplanes aren't running, nobody's using oil. So the price of oil, supply and demand, has plummeted right now. The opposite happened in the oil crisis in the mid-'70s. Huge recession because oil, of course, is heating oil in large ports of the Midwest and New England, gasoline for cars, and also for trucks. And don't forget, trucks still move most of the goods in America. Everything went up. Prices of everything went up. Of course, salaries did not in a month. Congress passed a tax cut, but it's a very, very slow recovery. So Nixon also has to deal with a huge problem with a recession, with prices of everything going up and salaries staying the same or people laid off. Personal comment, this was pretty terrifying at the time. We weren't used to this. I was in graduate school here in Austin, and I remember going to the store and looking to buy a carton of margarine at the time. There were 3 stickers on the single carton of margarine, and out of curiosity, I just peeled them off to see what was going on. That carton of margarine, when it was placed in the refrigerator container, had been increased 3 times in less than a week. So you can see how frantic people were. Their salaries weren't going up, but everything, including the price of food, was going up dramatically. We have the same situation in reverse today. No salaries, the prices of food aren't going up, but you have nothing to pay for it with. And this is not a good thing, and people were very, very strung out at the time. Okay, so we need to go on. With Nixon, so he did some very good things, also some new environmental laws. Now we'll talk about the bad things. This is an editorial comment, but I can't stand Richard Nixon. Most people, I try to tell you good and bad, and there are some good things with Richard Nixon, but I blame Richard Nixon for a lot of things. Number one thing I blame him for is up until Nixon, up until the mid-'70s, you would hear, and you still hear, older men, grandfathers, even fathers sometimes, you will hear them called Dick. Not after Nixon. Dick has always had slang connotations, always been kind of sexual. After Richard Nixon, Dick became a dirty word and very common in American English, and we don't use it anymore. You would never call anybody named Richard today Dick. You would call them Rich or Richie or something else, or Richard. But that's just not used anymore. On the other hand, if you see 67-year-old guys, often you hear that. I have 2 people I know who are called Dick, still are called Dick. But Richard Nixon did that. The other thing he did, and it goes back before him to Vietnam, as I mentioned, where the intelligence was correct, but the public was not being told the truth. So starting with Vietnam, people begin to distrust our government. This is a new thing in American history. Up until this point, people absolutely trusted the government. I don't know what the percentages were. 80, 90% believed the government was telling the truth. Think about Franklin Roosevelt. When he closed the banks, he went on with one of his fireside chats and said, don't take your money out of the bank. It's okay. I'm going to take care of the banks. Go and put your money back in the bank. And the American public did. They actually trusted Franklin Roosevelt. They trusted Theodore Roosevelt too. Today, if somebody told you, do such and such, we would do the opposite. We assume today that the government is not telling us the truth, and this has not directly to do with Donald Trump, although he's not helping it. This goes back to the Vietnam War, where we were lied to, and particularly to Richard Nixon. He is the man who really created and really snowballed the distrust in the American government, and that's one reason I can't stand him. He also created perhaps the greatest constitutional crisis in American history after Andrew Jackson and the nullification crisis. So we need to know a little bit more about Richard Nixon. I'm starting with slide 19 there. And a little bit about his biography. He is one of the weirder characters in American history. He is an oddball loner from the beginning. He was born in Southern California in an extremely poor, of all things, a Quaker family. When he was very young, he was the middle brother of three. The older brother and the younger brother both died of tuberculosis in childhood before the age of 10. Extremely poor family to start out with. The mother basically scrubbed floors in the tuberculosis sanitarium to pay for the treatment for one of her sons, who ended up dying anyway. So this is a child who had a lot of trauma in his background. Had no money, went to local community college, graduated, and then got a scholarship, and part of the time, at least a partial scholarship, to Duke, went to Duke Law School, graduated third in his class in the law school, which is pretty good, but in that class was voted, people were cruel then, least likely to succeed, which is incredibly ironic. This is, he looking for a job towards the end of the Depression. There aren't any jobs, basically. Governments, in many cases, had a hiring freeze, getting serious government jobs. So he answered an ad in the local newspaper in Southern California, and he started working with the political party, the Republican Party. And they ran him against a local representative for California, for Southern California. Very popular representative who funded orphanages, was voted most honest in the House of Representatives, which is incredibly ironic because against him in 1939, Richard Nixon is running a total lying smear campaign. He smeared this guy, Jerry Voorhees, as a communist, which he had no connections with, a communist sympathizer, that he has connections with Russia, and asked later about it. This is a quote from Nixon. Of course, I knew Jerry wasn't a commie. The important thing is to win. Says a lot about Richard Nixon. You win any way you can. You need to play dirty, you play dirty. His second campaign against a woman in 1946, also for the House of Representatives from Southern California, did the same thing. This is 46. There's serious concern about communist expansion, and he started passing out pamphlets and billboards that called her a pink lady. Pink as in a little bit red, a little bit communist. She was, and I'm quoting from some of these pamphlets, pink down to her underwear. She was also married to a Jewish man, and part of his campaign, and I'm quoting here again, don't send a Jew's wife to the Senate. So Richard Nixon is not a nice guy from the beginning, from the very beginning. It is this woman that he ran against who coined the term Tricky Dick, and that was Richard Nixon's nickname. You never know what he's going to pull. Personality, he was not very well liked as a kid. He's not the guy you're going to pick for the first on your baseball team. He never trusted people from the beginning. We don't know where all of this comes from. He was very secretive. He was very insecure, very much a loner. He would never shake your hand. He would never look you in the eye when he talked to you. But very smart, very hardworking, a very good memory, even for small details, and he saw the big picture in things. China was an example. The strategic nuclear arms de-escalation was an example. But ambitious, pragmatic, whatever worked for him. He had, although he was raised very poor, absolutely no empathy. And again, you have to look at this. It's not necessarily whether they're rich or poor running the country, but what do they know about you and your daily life? Again, the Roosevelts, two of our wealthiest presidents, did more for poor people than almost anybody else. Richard Nixon, probably our poorest president, did nothing for poor people. His tragic flaw, if you remember in Greek tragedy, it's always a great hero who is brought down by a tragic flaw. In the ancient Greeks, it was usually hubris, false pride. In Nixon's case, he is a pathological liar. He lied on big things. He lied on small things. He lied when he didn't even have to lie. He lied when he knew it would be checked. And as we know, people who lie consistently can't tell the truth from falsehood at the end, and that probably happened to Nixon. A British commentator once said of Nixon, the American, and I'm quoting, the American presidency has come full circle from George Washington, who couldn't tell a lie, and that was not true, to Nixon, who couldn't tell the truth. Nixon was a pathological liar from the beginning. In high school, if any one of you has ever participated in debate, my oldest son went to state high school debate, you stick pretty close. You have to support your positions with factual information. Nixon would make up information. He would make up statistics. They could check this stuff even without computers. This is in high school. In his campaigns, as we saw, he lied systematically about his opponents. Again, fake news. How do you tell? How do you tell the truth? It's becoming more difficult today. Later on as president, when they carpet bombed Cambodia, Nixon is asked about it, and he said, this never happened. He lies to the American public, although this comes out very quickly. One of his most famous incidents, and probably one of the most famous speeches in American history, it's about 20 minutes long. You can Google it. You can get it on YouTube without any problem. Google Richard Nixon checkers speech. Checkers as in Chinese checkers. Okay? Checkers was the name of the dog. And Nixon was running with Eisenhower and put on as vice president. He had only been a senator at that point for a year and a half. He had just moved into the Senate. And there's some information going around that Nixon has a secret campaign fund, an illegal campaign fund that wealthy people are giving to him. Eisenhower couldn't stand Nixon, didn't want him on the ticket. Nixon has to do something because the rumors are escalated. He asks one of the networks for half an hour airtime to defend himself. They give it to him, and he gives his very famous checkers speech. In the speech, he says, I have no illegal campaign contributions. I didn't do anything wrong. Look at my wife. She only has a cloth coat. She doesn't have a mink coat like all the other women in Washington. I haven't taken any money. We live very modestly, which was actually fairly true. And I am not giving back the one thing that a young man in Texas sent to the White House for my 2 little daughters. He sent us a little Cocker Spaniel, black and white, and the kids called the dog Checkers, and we're not returning the dog as an illegal contribution. He lied the whole 20 minutes in front of the entire nation. And you can see, even Googling just a couple minutes of that speech, this is a man who is not very comfortable on television, is not very comfortable at all with the media. The whole thing is a lie. Not the whole thing. He did live very modestly. His wife didn't have a mink coat, but there was a slush fund, there was a secret campaign fund, and he knows it. So he gets in front of the public, and at the end of that, the reason it's so brilliant, at the very end of that speech, he says, I am asking you, the American public, to judge me. You write or call your congressman and tell them if you want Dick Nixon as on the presidential election campaign, if you want me for vice president. And of course, he's just talked about his little kids, his little dog, and people wrote in all over the country, and the responses were something like 80-1, yes, keep Richard Nixon on the ticket. And poor Eisenhower said, I'm stuck with him. I got to keep him now. He lied. He lied about things he didn't have to. He called his wife Pat and talked about her being Irish, and you know the Irish are always very stubborn. His wife's name was Thelma, not Pat, although she was nicknamed Pat. He said openly on television, my wife was born on St. Patrick's Day. She wasn't born on St. Patrick's Day. People could look this up. People did look this up, but by then it's too late. He's been on national television. Okay. Everybody in Washington knew this. Truman, like many others, at the time when Nixon is just starting out, Truman said, and Truman was pretty outspoken, all the time I've been in politics, there's only 2 people I can't stand, and Nixon is one. Not only doesn't he give a damn about the people, he doesn't know the difference between truth and lying. And he was absolutely correct. So, 1972, Nixon is running for re-election. He was elected in 1968. This will be his second term. And he knows he's winning. He's winning in all the polls. So everything in Watergate was completely unnecessary. He didn't have to do this. The Democrats did not get Richard Nixon. He is not a victim. He did this to himself. Watergate, Nixon was charged with 21 different crimes, federal crimes, including, just short list, forgery, bribery, illegal wiretapping, obstructing justice, destroying evidence, failure to report a felony, conspiracy to use government agencies in illegal activities, plus another 10. Okay, so if you look, I'm giving you a swift rundown on Watergate here. It's a complicated, difficult topic, so I'm giving you the short version. You look at slide 20, that is Watergate. Watergate is an office building and hotel near downtown D.C. It is on the river, on the Anacostia River. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., I was walking by one day, saw the sign on the building and ran inside and stood in the lobby just so I could say I stood in Watergate. Previous to all of this, even before the Watergate event, Nixon had compiled what he called an enemies list. Does any of this sound familiar? People who were political opponents of him. And he had already asked the IRS and the CIA to harass people on his enemies list. This is illegal. They didn't do it. Also previous to this were the Pentagon Papers. These were military documents proving that there were no Chinese and very few North Vietnamese communists in South Vietnam, and really told the truth about what was going on in Vietnam. They were leaked to the public by a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg. Nixon himself ordered a break-in of this man's office in order to get basically dirt to blackmail him with, to stop the publication of the Pentagon Papers, and the Washington Post had to make a decision. Do we go ahead and publish these? They had confirmed that they were accurate with their own reporters on the ground in Vietnam. Or do we listen to the president and follow what he says? Because if we don't please the president, he's going to come down hard on us, and life will become difficult. The Washington Post made the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers completely. Interesting parallels to our own media today, of course. Okay, so all of this is background. In the Watergate building was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. To re-elect, the election campaign is coming along very soon in the fall, and in the middle of no place, during that summer, the night watchman at the Watergate building notices that there's a light on in one of the offices. And he kind of checks around the corner. He calls the police. The police come in, and they find that there are several men in the Democratic headquarters office with the lights on and the door propped open, and they are photocopying documents. The police immediately arrest them, and we found out later they are taken to jail, they are arraigned, and we find out later that they were hired by CREEP, and this is the actual name. I mean, you can't get better than that. The campaign to re-elect the president, Nixon. So CREEP, appropriately named, was a political campaign, a group of political operatives. They had hired 4 Cubans, again, this Cuban connection, to break in to Democratic headquarters. What are they trying to do? Find out what the campaign plans were so they could basically undercut them. They weren't very good burglars. They left the doors taped open. They had the lights on. So they were arrested. The Cubans had in their pockets brand new $100 bills. The $100 bills were traced to the CREEP committee, the Republican committee. They had address books with them that had White House addresses. They are taken to jail. A month later, one of them starts to squeal. Who paid you? This guy paid me. They tracked down that guy. Who paid you? The next guy paid me. The next guy paid me. And the money is traced back to Nixon's right-hand man, Howard Hunt. 3 days after this event, did Nixon order it? We still don't know, but very shortly afterwards, he knew about it and he orders a cover-up. Within a week, he had ordered his Attorney General, John Mitchell, to call off the FBI, don't have the FBI investigate. He tried to get government employees to lie under oath, to change their story. But the money is traced back to the White House. Who did this? If you look at slide 21, this is investigative reporting. And the 2 great reporters from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, very famous. The Senate organizes an investigating committee. Woodward and Bernstein had gotten secret information from a source that they promised not to reveal, and they kept their word. They did not reveal him. His code name was Deep Throat. Deep Throat was the name of a porn star in a porn movie, but his code name was Deep Throat. And they were able to trace all the connections back with this guy's information. They kept their word. About 5 years ago, Deep Throat himself came out and said, I was the one. The reporters confirmed it. Deep Throat was the number 2 man at the FBI at the time. He was so appalled by Richard Nixon and his actions and the whole Watergate cover-up that he was giving information to the press. Direct connections to today. What is the role of the press? What is the role of investigative reporters? What do we do with a president who is lying to the public? These are all contemporary issues. Editorial comment, it never occurred to me in my lifetime that we would have a similar event to Watergate. I thought that was a once-in-a-lifetime event. Congress investigates. There are live television hearings, which is on slide 22. And the whole country's watching. I had a summer job. I remember we had a little TV in the corner, and the whole time in the summer job, everybody is watching the televised hearings. One of Nixon's aides in the White House, named John Dean, not important, finally told the whole story. He mentioned that Nixon had illegally taped all his conversations in the White House and everybody else who had come into the Oval Office. The committee demands to see the tapes or hear the tapes. These are oral tapes. Nixon claims, this should sound familiar, executive privilege. I am not turning over the tapes. The Senate committee goes straight to the Supreme Court and demands the Supreme Court order Nixon to turn over these hours and hours of tapes. Nixon waits for about a week, and the whole country's watching. Will he follow the orders of the Supreme Court, or will he defy the Supreme Court? Is the president above the law? Does the president have executive privilege, and where does it stop? Nixon, after about a week, finally turned over the tapes. There is one tape that is missing about 18 minutes. Only Nixon and his secretary knew what was on it. Neither of them ever told. We never found out what was on that tape. Something was erased for about 18 minutes. But there is enough stuff on that tape to convict Richard Nixon 10 times over. Not only does it prove he is directly involved with Watergate, which is illegal on 21 different counts, but it shows what an SOB Nixon was. He was a racist, he was a sexist, he was a nasty, nasty person. And on those tapes, they're unedited except for those 18 minutes, you can hear him talking smack about absolutely everybody. Once Congress gets those tapes, Nixon resigns in late August of 74. Remember, the election is in November of 74. And the next slide is one of my favorite posters, slide number 23. The committee goes on to indict and prosecute everybody involved with Watergate. Nixon's attorney general, his aides, everybody involved with it. 25 others are jailed for terms from 2 to 20 years for their involvement in Watergate. The only person not convicted, not jailed, was Richard Nixon. Why? Because he resigned. You can't indict somebody if he is no longer in office. And Richard Nixon was no longer in office. Okay. The legacy of Watergate, huge effects on American psychology, on American politics. First of all, it proved that the Supreme Court and the law are primary, that even the president must follow the laws of the United States. Because Nixon said, does any of this sound familiar? If the president does it, that makes it legal. That's a direct quote from Nixon. Okay? In Watergate, we determined no one, including the president, is above the laws. Another effect of it, obviously, is the presidency loses power and power shifts back to Congress. Congress is the one that indicted and prosecuted these cases, and the presidency was weakened, at least for a time. It shows the importance of the fourth branch of our government, which is the press, which is a free press, especially investigative reporting. If you have balance of powers, if you have a democracy, it rests on a free press to investigate wherever the information leads. And I think the most significant effect of this was, of course, that from Watergate on, the public does not trust the president, does not trust the U.S. government. Depends, yes and no, it goes up and down, but from Watergate on, we're very suspicious. My generation is very suspicious of the U.S. government and all government. Your generation is even more suspicious with good reason. We question everything. We question the press as well, but we question everything the government does. That went straight back to Watergate and Vietnam. Okay? This is permanent. Eisenhower, quote, "It is only an alert and informed citizenry which can keep these abuses from coming about again. So it is our job to keep democracy, not the president's, not Congress. It is the job of the public. And I'm going to leave it with there. We will pick up with Carter and Reagan next time. Stay safe. Be well.